What is up, everybody, and how's it going? I'm Alex Goldstick, and you are listening to the Spring Forward podcast. Since our last episode, the Spring League has announced the first showcase of 2020. In a statement released regarding the showcase, the Spring League CEO, Brian Woods, writes, quote, "The Spring League will host a 4-day showcase from July 14th to 17th in Denver, Colorado. Our top priority during these unprecedented times is the well-being of our players, coaches, and staff, while continuing to provide a platform for aspiring pro football talent. In order to safeguard the health of those attending the showcase in Denver, a safety protocol is being designed in consultation with Dr. Paul Auerbach of Stanford University. The Spring League will continue to monitor the current health crisis and will have a contingency plan in place in the event that conditions do not improve." End quote. For those prospective players listening to this episode, a link to apply to the showcase will be posted in the description to the pod. Coincidentally, today's episode features an interview with the aforementioned Dr. Auerbach. Over the past 2 years, Auerbach and a team of collaborators from Purdue University's Electrical and Computer Engineering department have been studying brain trauma as it relates to football players. The team attended the Spring League Showcase 2018 in San Diego and equipped 78 players with sensors that could measure acceleration and deceleration forces to the head. Last month, the research from that camp was released and confirmed many of Dr. Auerbach's suspicions, especially as it relates to the repeated blows to the head that linemen take on every play. His study has reinforced his theory that banning the 3- and 4-point stance on the line would significantly reduce long-term brain injuries to linemen on both sides of the ball. As I'm a podcaster and he's a scientist, it's probably best if Dr. Auerbach explains the rest of the study. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Dr. Paul Auerbach is the Redlich Family Professor Emeritus in the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Stanford University School of Medicine. He's an adjunct professor of military and emergency medicine at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. His career has included time spent at Duke, Dartmouth, UCLA, Stanford, Temple, UCSF, and Vanderbilt. Most recently, he co-authored a study using Spring League players on head trauma in football. Dr. Auerbach, welcome to Spring Forward.
Good morning.
So, first and foremost, in these unprecedented times, how is someone like yourself spending their time during the pandemic? Are you home or involved in the pandemic efforts in some way?
I'm either at home or I'm at work, like everybody else, doing what I can to maintain my sanity during the shelter, while fulfilling my obligations at work and otherwise with my family and friends.
And so far, you're healthy and things are okay?
Yes, thanks for asking. No personal issues with any COVID-related illness.
Well, that is obviously excellent. In addition to everything we just mentioned, you have a BA in religion from Duke and went to med school there too. You also hold a Master of Science in Management from the Stanford School of Business. You're a co-founder of the Wilderness Medical Society and have written books and articles on emergency medicine, marine animals, scuba diving, and even a book of underwater photography. So where does your interest in sports and sports medicine fit into all of these interests and expertises?
I was a very average athlete in high school and college, and am both a participant in sports and a spectator of sports. I think that athletics are very important for a variety of reasons, the most important of which is exercise and staying in shape is integral to physical and emotional well-being in my family, and safety and participation for youths all the way through the professional level. So that all migrates into a regular interest in sports, and most recently in keeping them as safe as possible without changing their essential nature. That's the that's the balancing act. You can't take all the risk out of life, and you can't take all the risks out of sports. So the focus is to try and identify what might be unnecessary risks, things that could be changed to make particular sports safer while not ruining them for the people that want to participate and the people who get pleasure out of watching them.
Right. Now, this conversation, this interview will mainly revolve around the study you did in football with the Spring League. That study seemed to revolve around a rule change eliminating down linemen that you had suggested in a 2016 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and then another opinion editorial that was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2018. Was that rule change that was published in those two articles the driving force behind this study?
The driving force behind the study was our wish to attempt a rules change that would make the sport safer based on what we knew about the activities involved in football and where the head injuries seemed to be coming from, which was blows to the head. This looked particularly at the linemen who had repeated brain injuries that were felt to be quote unquote subconcussive. They didn't result in the short term in symptoms of concussion that many people are familiar with: headache, blurred vision, nausea, lack of the ability to maintain attention, concentration, unsteadiness, and a general ill feeling. They were felt to follow repetitive subconcussive injuries where in the immediate aftermath of the blow to the head, there might not be any symptoms, but over time, as these injuries occurred over and over again, there was accumulative damage to the brain, and that has been felt by some to be what causes chronic traumatic encephalopathy, repetitive head injuries, whether they're subconcussive or concussive. So watching football being played and seeing linemen butt heads like rams on every play at the snap of the ball, we hypothesized that if we could eliminate that particular activity, we might decrease the number of head acceleration events that contribute to eventually to CTE. I was fortunate to find kindred spirits in Tom Talavage and Eric Nauman at Purdue, who are excellent engineers and have looked at this previously with sophisticated imaging techniques, including MRIs. And they were and are very good with sensor technology and how to conduct a study like this. And so they saw what I had written, contacted me some time ago and said it would be great if we could work together someday. And then that opportunity presented itself when Brian Woods from the Spring League saw the Wall Street Journal editorial and also contacted me and said, I think you might be onto something. How can I help? And the way to help was to provide a group of players who would be willing to participate in a study to actually look at this. We had not had any success, or I hadn't had any success trying to recruit high school football teams or college football teams or youth football teams to participate in this kind of study. We thought we would likely start at the less experienced level and work our way up before this would be considered by professional teams. But Brian came very early on with an offer to assist at the professional level, because that's what the Spring League is.
Yeah. Now, before we get into the results and how you actually pulled this off, you mentioned that this study was conducted in collaboration with Purdue. So just from a purely academic standpoint, how does a study work across multiple institutions, multiple people? I mean, they're obviously in Indiana, you're in California. How do you put that together? How do you get your institutions to work together to pull off something like this?
In this case, it wasn't that difficult. For clinical trials that involve humans, you have to go through an institutional review board. So people look at your study design and what you intend to do, and they make sure that, in their opinion, it's safe, it's likely to result in meaningful data, and they approve it as it is, or they make recommendations for how to modify it. In this case, because we were going to be collaborating between two institutions, we went to both of our institutional review boards to get each of their approval. And we didn't have to do that, but we thought it was the best thing to do. There are a lot of multi-center trials that get approval from a single institutional review board, and then they are able to conduct the trial. In this case, we put together a trial, how we would do it, what our budget would be, who would be responsible for what, and we got approval at both institutions to go forward with it. I will say a delightfully minimal amount of bureaucracy.
Well, that's always a surprise and a pleasant one at that, I would assume.
Yeah. Yeah, no question about it. Stanford was very supportive. Purdue was very supportive, and that made it much easier to get this going.
The first time I saw anything written about this by you was in 2016. Obviously, you wrote it again in the Wall Street Journal in 2018. I believe the first time I saw this was at the Spring League in 2018, the Spring League Showcase San Diego in the summer of 2018. So how long does a study of this magnitude take to conduct and then publish the results, which just came out last month?
You have to go through the study design process, the study approval process, then you actually have to do the study, evaluate the data, draw whatever conclusions you're going to draw, then write it up, submit it for peer review publication, which is the strongest validation of a study that's been performed. And then once it's accepted by a journal, then they have to go through the scheduling and publication process, which can take a year or more after a study is peer reviewed, approved, the journal decides that they want to publish it. A lot of times they're backed up with other studies or other articles that they're going to publish. So you have to get in the queue and wait your turn.
How many Spring Leagues and Spring League players did it take to conduct this?
Well, we got this particular study, which was, I think it's fair to say, it was really a pilot study. So this was a proof of concept. We knew that if this was successful, that we would likely want to acquire more data, more players, larger numbers, to put emphasis on the validity of the study. And we did that study in April of 2018. And we're in the process now of doing the data analysis, then getting the paper written, and if it is worthy, if we feel it's worthy of publication, we'll submit it as a follow-on study to this first study and hope that it's accepted and published. And that will put greater emphasis on what we did with the pilot study. The pilot study gave us great hope because of what the data showed. So we went into the next study with a fair amount of optimism and a lot of enthusiasm.
And I guess the ultimate question, what were the top line findings of the study?
Yeah, the top line is that we could successfully measure the head acceleration events using the method we chose, using the X patches, and that we were able to identify the players who had the magnitude and number of head acceleration events they had by using this methodology, and that by eliminating the down offensive line position, we could decrease the number of head acceleration events to a significant degree, such that would be a reasonable safety rule that could be deployed in football to try and protect players from having the number of head acceleration events that they currently have with the existing rules.
Yeah. Now you just said offensive linemen only. Was it both sides
Well,
of the ball?
we eliminated the position in offensive lineman, but we saw that the beneficial effect extended beyond the offensive lineman. It extended to the defensive lineman, because if they're not banging into the offensive lineman, they're going to benefit. We found benefit to other positions as well. Some of them were not necessarily intuitive. And we also were able to identify some high-risk positions like tight ends, linebackers, etc. And subsequent studies by us or by others can look at rules modifications directed at those positions that might decrease the risk profile for head acceleration events for those players. I think the big plus to come out of this, in addition to identifying a particular rules change that could be beneficial, is that this establishes a method of study such that we can move from sometimes emotionally charged discussions that are opinions about what will or won't work into a research-based orientation towards football and other sports, where attempts can be made to study particular elements of the competition and make recommendations and modifications to games, equipment, rules, practices, etc., such that we can go to an evidence-based position on some of these things. I just was contacted by youth football, thanking us for having published this study, saying that this was a rules change that they were intuitively about to implement, and now and for which they were getting some pushback, and now they had data to support their position on it.
You mentioned the X patch. Can you get into some of the more technical details about how you pulled this off, person to person with the players? Where was it installed? How was it installed? What were you, taping?
Well, the players who became research subjects were incredibly collaborative. We explained to them early on, this was all voluntary on their part. We explained to them early on that the point of this was to try and study aspects of the game that might make it safer for them. Players are aware that there's a lot of discussion about CTE and head injuries, and they were eager to be part of a study that might cast some data analysis on what they were doing that might result in making the game safer for them. So it was a bit inconvenient for them, because prior to the practices or gameplay, they needed to take the time to enable placement of a sensor behind their ear, which they wore inside their helmets. They weren't particularly uncomfortable, but I would say frequently wearing it was of nuisance severity to the players, and they put up with that so that they could participate. And they were very good about stopping to get their sensors put on, having them be collected at the end of practice. It kept them from getting on and off the field as fast as I think they would have liked to. So we're very grateful to each and every player who participated, and to all the coaches who supported this, because the lack of compliance with the right way to put these on and off Not running the plays on a strict schedule could have ruined the study, and none of that occurred. So we had great collaboration from everybody involved. And of course, Brian was terrific to allow us to come there in the first place and suggest that we do the study with his league. You know, the XFL was very interested in what we were doing. They were there testing out some rules changes for their league. And so they saw what we were doing, and we were able to explain it to them. They seemed to be quite interested in safety.
Yeah, and you just mentioned the XFL. I believe you were at our camp in Austin in 2019 that the XFL was also a part of. So was that in collaboration with them? Was that a ongoing part of this study, or sort of phase 2?
No, that they were. It was coincidental that they were in Austin, and you know, we had a large presence there. They had a large presence, and so we had a lot of opportunities to interact and watch what they were doing, and they watched what we were doing, and you know, we talked about the game in general, and I think everybody showed concern for the health and safety of the players. I'm hoping that over time, as I said, we've established a methodology where people won't be afraid to make recommendations for changes to any aspect of the game that might make it safer, whether it's a head injury or any other kind of injury, or the health of the players. We've seen changes over time with how fluids and electrolytes are handled. Unfortunately, because there have been episodes of severe heat illness that have caused great harm to certain players. And, you know, the whole issue of brain injury is enormous in football and other sports as well. Nobody wants to see anybody get hurt. And I think everybody's looking for reasonable solutions to solve significant health issues related to participants.
Well, and due to the results of this study, which you say is just a pilot, the Spring League has already eliminated a down lineman for the future. So, and you mentioned youth football, the XFL. Have you seen any meaningful steps towards exploring rule changes yet, or is it still just so heavy with emotion and quote unquote preserving the game?
As I mentioned, I was contacted by Football USA, people that work with Football USA, to say we are likely implementing the no down lineman rules change for youths. And I think they may go larger than we did. They may not do it just for offensive linemen. They may not teach kids to go down on offense or defense. So we're seeing that. I think it will take time for all this to filter into the game at different levels. I think the resistance is not coaches or owners or anyone else maintaining old rules in spite of the fact that injuries occur. I think the fear is that by changing the game, it may become less like the quote unquote football that they're used to watching. That could potentially be problematic in terms of win-loss records and spectator enjoyment. So those all have to be factored in. One of the things we saw, although we didn't measure it, it was subjective, was that the game didn't seem to be ruined in any way. It was in some ways even more fun to watch. It was faster. It didn't take away from gameplay. The offenses were still able to very successfully run running plays and pass plays. We didn't get complaints from the players or coaches that it was ruining the game. And objections that I heard before the study when running this idea past some football coaches and past some team physicians was that it might change the game and therefore it would be opposed. And I've not gotten those comments since this study has been published. what I've personally heard from people I've shared it with have been expressions of gratitude for bringing objectivity to the discussion and for making an attempt to make the game safer. Our intent was never and likely won't be in the future to get rid of football. It's to save football. If there's going to be potentially less participation, likely at the youth level and then up through high school, and that would clearly filter up to college and potentially to the feeder systems into the pros. If people are going to stay away from the game because they're afraid it's unsafe, then by making the game safer, we might actually be saving the sport.
Right, and as we mentioned, the Spring League has already implemented some changes based on your research, and we certainly hope that people can see the Spring League game as one that isn't ruined and one that is still helping accomplished players achieve their dreams of professional football. One last question, switching gears a bit, but obviously still staying in the medical field. Beyond this study, you've become sort of the go-to medical source for Brian, our CEO, and in the Spring League, and have been tabbed to consult with the league for the best possible way to go about holding the Denver showcase in July safely during the coronavirus pandemic. The Spring League already, in normal times, is uniquely situated to involve only a single venue, a single hotel for the players. What are some additional elements that you think you may advise the league on to successfully hold a camp 6 or 7 weeks from now?
I don't know the specifics yet. I'm going to look at the plan that they have, look at current public health recommendations and the science around distancing, around disinfection techniques, around all of the modalities that we're using now to try and keep people safe from spread of a virus, early diagnosis, if that's relevant, and try and apply that to whatever I offer as comments to the Spring League. We're looking at reopening lots of life now, whether that be sports, music, gatherings of all sorts. We're very concerned about what are being called super spreading events, where large collections of people in the same location, if there's virus floating around in that gathering, will have a higher likelihood of spreading to multiple people at the same time as opposed to one-on-one in our normal activities, daily activities of living. So I think we have to look at all of it, use science, common sense, and take into account what a Spring League is intended to accomplish and see if there are recommendations that might include modifications that would enhance the safety profile without subverting the fundamental nature of what the Spring League is intended to accomplish. If both goals can be met, that would be the ideal outcome. What we know about life is sometimes there are trade-offs that aren't perfect. It might be that some safety recommendations would adversely impact the nature and spirit of the Spring League. I don't know yet because I haven't looked at it in detail. Every sport is going to need to go through that at every level. So it's not just football. And it's when I say every level, that's youth, high school, college, post-collegiate, professional, recreational. Anytime we have groups of people gathering, we're going to have to look at the numbers, what their contact profile is, how close they're going to be to each other, what the risks are associated with that, as best we know them. Because in coronavirus, as in concussion in sports, we frequently have a lot of opinions being thrown around and lack some data to support some of those opinions. Where we have data, that's the best situation. I'll be talking to Brian about whether we can gather data at the same time that he's opening up again, because that's an opportunity to set an example or perhaps even a standard for other groups that are looking to get guidance.
Right.
We showed that we could reduce head acceleration events in professional level athletes in a certain football environment. It would be nice to be able to extrapolate that to football at multiple levels and in multiple situations, and provide guidance to people who are trying to make the game safer. Same thing with COVID. We'll look at everything, and I'm an N of one in science terms, so I'll have my opinions, and I'll try and be as evidence-based as I can and be as commonsensical as I can, so that I offer the best advice I can to someone who's asking me for my opinion. That's not different than what I do every day when I see patients and they come in with a situation and want my advice about what to do about it.
Well, we certainly appreciate your medical expertise, what you're doing for the game in the long term, and hopefully what you're doing for the Spring League in the short term this summer. So thank you for joining us, explaining the study, and we wish you well through this pandemic.
Well, the same to you and to everybody else out there listening. This is a time of high anxiety and complicated time medically, societally, economically, in all aspects. And so everybody has to be patient with one another, be compassionate, try and help each other out. That's how we'll get through all this, and resist the finger pointing and the lawsuits and all the adversarial activities that frequently dominate when there's difference of opinion or conflict. And that holds true for concussion in sports, head injuries, and it holds true for COVID. So everybody's got to be willing to cut each other a little bit of slack, be evidence-based, and keep trying to help each other out. And we'll get through all this. We'll certainly get through football, and hopefully we'll get through COVID as well, using that approach.
All right, that will do it for this episode of Spring Forward. Thank you to Dr. Auerbach for the in-depth interview on this study, and as someone who was on the field to see the team work and gather data firsthand, it's awesome to see the report be released. In addition to the Denver Showcase application, there will be a link to the report in the description of this podcast. You can follow the Spring League on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at the Spring League. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Alex Goldstick. All music was provided to the Spring Forward podcast by Joshua Rosner. From the Spring Forward pod to you listening, we hope you are staying safe during these strange and scary times. We wish you nothing but safety and good health as we hope for a speedy end to the pandemic. Until next time, later.